This is ContraZoom,
where we go back and forth about film.
I'm Dakota Arsenault.
And I'm Rachel Ho.
A new recurring series we have started doing is celebrating movie anniversaries. Last month, we celebrated the 45th birthday of John Carpenter's Halloween, and back in May, the James Bond franchise turned 60 with the release of Dr. No in 1963. Today, we are turning the clocks back even further to 1948 and the film The Red Shoes, directed by Powell and Pressburger. We're a month late, as technically the movie came out in October of 48, but Halloween-related shows took precedence. The reason for doing this episode is twofold. One, 75 years as a nice round anniversary that is too good to pass up. And two, Rachel actually gifted me the 4K Criterion edition of this film, and I've been itching to watch it ever since. So thank you very much, Rachel, for the lovely gift. But before I share the backstory of this movie, I'd love to know what was your exposure to the film before then?
Nothing at all. I hadn't heard of it. And I was actually going to ask you, why did I give that to you? Why was that title? I remember there was a specific reason why that movie came up.
I think,
but I can't remember exactly why.
The old Sight and Sound list or something like that, or it was just like,
Oh, yes. It was, I think you were saying like that was one of the only ones within like maybe the top 10 or something like that you hadn't seen or something like that. I think yeah, you're right though. It was on the list and it was like you hadn't seen this one in particular. And I think you had mentioned that you wanted to watch it or something. That's why I thought about it.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know much about this movie. If anything at all, I hadn't even heard of it, if I'm completely honest, which judging from the Wikipedia page sounds like a very big blind spot on my part. But yeah, I didn't know anything about it.
Yeah, it's funny. Growing up, I didn't really know anything about it either. And like, then you sort of hear about Powell and Pressburger, but it's like in conjunction with the word Technicolor, which I think is going to come up a lot in our discussion of the film. So it's very much like, oh yeah, Powell and Pressburger makes great Technicolor films. And that's kind of all you would hear about. And then you'd hear about movies like The Red Shoes. I'm going to talk about some of the other ones that they did as well. And it's just sort of funny where it was never... I feel like certain movies, whether it's, Casablanca or Citizen Kane or what have you, classic movies where often it's, the plot itself is the discussion point. It was just anytime you hear The Red Shoes discussed, it was just like, oh my God, it's so beautiful to look at. That was basically all I had ever heard about the movie was, oh, it's so beautiful to look at.
Yeah, and I think maybe if I could hurt, because every time I went to go Google something, I did start typing like Red Shoe Diaries, which is just more,
very, very
I suppose, more of the media I was familiar with. But no, so Powell and like those guys, I associated them with, yes, Technicolor, but also Black Narcissus. I never say that right. It's like that Gemma Arterton. I struggle with certain words. Anyways, so I knew of them, and I knew of them as being like important people in film, but never enough. Like they didn't intrigue me enough to be like, I need to go watch their movies. Which is funny because like you bring up, something like Casablanca or Citizen Kane, and I would say like people like Orson Welles and Alfred Hitchcock. It's like you hear so much about them, and then you're compelled to go and watch their film. But for some reason, these guys, I never did. I don't know why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like they occupy the tier under as far as, great directors. And it's not a slight of them, but it's more of your favorite filmmaker's favorite filmmaker category.
Very much so. Yeah, it is very much so. But you would think, though, like that alone would make it them compelling to go and watch. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I clearly am just not the cinephile that... Not that I think I am. I don't think I'm very much of a cinephile, but I'm clearly not in this, and I'm not in that realm. I'm not in that realm. It's a certain type of film person, I think, that goes deep with these guys, and that sounded weird, but no, I'm outside of that. But now that I'm in, I think I'll watch some of their other ones, even though I was mixed on this, but we'll get into that later.
Yeah. I don't think this is going to be a full spoilerific show, but definitely enough that we're probably going to talk about that if you have not seen The Red Shoes, you're probably going to not want certain things spoiled. Because I definitely appreciate it going in blind, not really knowing anything what was happening. So this is your spoiler warning. I don't know if we'll spoil everything, but I'm putting it out there now before we get started.
I mean, the movie came out in 1948, so
It did, yes, that's very true.
It's a bit of fair game. After like a 50-year mark, I feel like we can be like, it's okay.
All right.
Miss Page, what do you want from life? To live?
To dance.
I could make you one of the greatest dancers the world has ever known. Music is all that matters. Nothing but the music.
We are trying to create something of beauty.
Well, in the 1930s, producer Alexander Korda tried a few times to get a ballet-themed movie made. First, it was one to be based on a famous male Russian dancer and choreographer with a screenplay written by Michael Powell. Then later, wanted to make a vehicle for his wife, Merle Oberon, to star in. He realized that his wife's inability to ballet dance would have meant an excessive use of a body double for the dancing sequences, and it wasn't feasible to make. Later on, Michael Powell and Eric Pressburger teamed up as a writing and directing duo who made such films as The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, A Matter of Life and Death, and Bill Antonio's all-time favorite film, Black Narcissus, that Rachel can't pronounce. In 1946, Powell realized that he had something with the script he wrote for Korda and purchased the rights to the material to make a film with Pressburger. The story was structured around a Russian impresario who founded the Ballet Russe in Paris. Powell decided to also incorporate the Hans Christian Andersen fable titled The Red Shoes. The film follows three main characters: Boris Lermontov, played by Anton Walbrook, who runs the Ballet Lermontov. After the premiere of his latest show, Lermontov meets two people. First is the niece of a wealthy patron, Victoria Page, played by Moira Shearer, who we learn is an aspiring dancer, and she gets invited to attend a rehearsal. The second is Julian Craster, played by Marius Goring, a young man who is a music student of the conductor. Craster's music had been inadvertently plagiarized by the conductor, and he goes to speak with Lermontov about the theft. After playing more of his own music for Boris, Julian gets offered a job within the company to help out with orchestra rehearsals. Eventually, Lermontov realizes the talent he has on his hands and decides to produce a new ballet starring Victoria and have Julian compose original music. The centerpiece of the film is a 17-minute sequence showing the titular ballet of the Red Shoes, which is about a young girl who puts on the red shoes after attending a ball and dancing the night away. The shoes refuse to let the girl rest and keep dancing on their own, regardless of the unwilling body attached to them. The film continues as we learn that Victoria and Julian have fallen in love, and Boris is unhappy as he demands utter control over everyone and everything, and fears that Victoria can both not have love in her life and be a committed dancer. After realizing the mistake that Alexander Korda tried to do with casting his wife, Powell and Pressburger knew they needed a dancer who can act, not an actor who can dance, as no actor would replicate the look of a world-class ballet dancer. So all the dance roles were cast with professional dancers who all had little to no acting experience. Chiefly was Moira Shearer, a 22-year-old up-and-coming star ballerina who was cast as Victoria Page, an incredibly demanding part. The film had its world premiere in London on July 22, 1948, but didn't have a worldwide release until October 21st, 75 years ago. Despite becoming one of the highest-grossing British films of all time in the UK, the reviews of the film were mixed at best, with both movie critics and ballet critics complaining that neither side was realistic. The movie did go on to be nominated for 5 Oscars, including Best Picture and Director, but only walked away with 2 wins, one for Best Original Score and one for Best Art Direction. Over the years, the film's negative had suffered such significant damage that it needed to be restored. Martin Scorsese and his longtime editor, Thelma Schoonmaker, who is actually Michael Powell's widow, led the charge along with the UCLA Film Department to restore the film to all its Technicolor glory. The new restoration premiered at Cannes in 2009 to great success and is now the definitive version and the one sold by the likes of Criterion. The film was such an inspiration, it directly was responsible for Gene Kelly making an American in Paris just 3 years later, and no behind-the-scenes ballet movie like Black Swan can have a review that doesn't mention the influence of the Red Shoes. So all that being said, I'm most curious about your thoughts on how film and ballet critics were divided, each making an accusation that the other side did it wrong. There is a saying in sports that when a trade happens and both sides of the fan base are unhappy, it probably means it was a good deal for both teams. How do you feel about the portrayal of dance done in a cinematic way?
It's hard to, like, I'm not a dancer. Like, I feel like if we were dancers, are you a dancer, Dakota?
Interestingly enough.
Have you taken formal dance lessons before? The closest I've ever gotten is I did adult ballet lessons, and I did it for maybe a year. No, actually, but maybe a few years, actually, not a year. And even in that short window, you get this glimpse into the ballet world that I find really fascinating, because the teacher who we got, he's a very accomplished ballet dancer, specifically in Canada, but like I think around the world as well. Like he's buddies, he's BFS with like Karen Kane and all that kind of stuff. And they're very protective of their art form. I'll say that. I think that the ballet dancers are very protective of their art form, as they should be. I think anybody should be protective of theirs, but maybe to a fault, to the point that maybe it seems inaccessible to the rest of the world. And I think that is why ballet has always been considered this like highfalutin, high class type thing that you do. Like, oh, you go to the ballet, dear, like that kind of thing. But I don't know if I can really speak to saying like, because I understand a lot of the criticisms were saying that's not how actual, like that's not how an actual ballet performance would be and stuff like that. And obviously a film takes a bit of liberties. That's the whole point of movie making. But I get it. Like I get why they're like, well, if you're going to portray our art form, then do it properly. And then they didn't. They kind of make it, I suppose maybe they think that they're cheapening it. But then is that because it's more almost like an elitist thing where they're not necessarily protective of the art itself, but they're protective of the class that it inspires? Yeah, I don't know. I'm just thinking about this off the top of my head, so it doesn't really make sense. But I wonder if that's what it is. It's more of them thinking that ballet got cheapened a little bit, and it started to look almost more like a play, more like a Broadway thing. And for them, ballet is something above those types of live performances. That's just the impression that I got in my very, very brief window in the ballet world. I
actually took dance lessons for 10 years as a kid.
Did you really? What kind of dance?
I did jazz, tap, ballet, and hip hop, all for different amounts of years. Mostly it was jazz and ballet, with hip hop being the next most, and hip hop being the least that I did. But yeah, I did it for a good decade. I was a competitive dancer for a little bit as well.
Wow, I was totally joking. I didn't realize that you actually had.
Yeah, I was quite.
Okay, so why are you asking me then? You have a much better pedigree to answer that. So, like for you, it's what I say. Like, does that ring true?
Maybe I was a kid, so I started when I think I was 4, and I went till I was about 13 or something like that. And then I kind of took up acting classes and never really looked back from that point on. So it's tough.
You're a real arts kid. You're a real performing arts kid.
Yeah, I was never interested in doing sports when I was a kid. I did 1 year of soccer and that was it. It was too much running. But yeah, so it's tough. I don't really know the world of dancing, because as a kid, you're so focused on just yourself and your friends and stuff like that. And being, usually the only boy in the class, or having only one other boy, it was a very different world compared to the girls in my class, where, it was very much different for them, where you're competing against, 15 to 20 other girls of your age group within your own studio. And then as soon as you start going to competitions where, there's hundreds of girls and there's maybe 10 guys total sort of thing throughout an entire weekend of competition, it's a very different world. So I don't feel comfortable commentating on that aspect. I will say though, I always hate the sort of criticism of when a movie is made about an industry and they're like, oh, well, it wasn't accurate, so, you got to dismiss the whole thing. Well, it's like, well, it's pretty much just a backdrop for telling, a story that they're doing. And I don't think this movie is trying to portray realistic, what it's like to be in a world famous ballet troupe that travels the world and all that sort of stuff. I think this is, merely a point of one person saying you cannot both have love in your life and be extremely dedicated. Now, whether or not you believe such a thing, you can understand if you're taking a devil's advocate perspective of If you believe the only way to be the best in the world at something is to be so fully committed that you have zero distractions, and that includes a partner, that includes children, that includes literally having any other hobbies or interests except for that single-minded focused goal, yeah, I understand where that's coming from. And so that's what this movie is trying to tell, is a story of, can you both have a life and be committed and be the best at something? And in that case, the movie works great because that's what it sets up. And so I don't care about is the ballet realistic, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. Especially since, personally, I thought the dancing looked fantastic, including the 17-minute sequence where it's basically just an uninterrupted, condensed version of this story. It looks beautiful. And there's no way that what is shot could be shown on a stage. It is shot in a cinematic way where you're weaving through sets, and there's these very intricate, not special effects, but like wire work and lifts and things like that just are not humanly possible to do on a stage all in one shot, where it had to have been broken up. And the fact the way they shoot it, it is very movie-like. It is very cinematic, and I love that. So I don't care that it wasn't realistic in that sense.
It's hard for me, it's hard for me to dismiss that, because I do agree with you. I think that the ballet is actually a very secondary part of this film. The crux of this movie is about ambition versus life. It's work-life balance. This is work-life balance before work-life balance was a thing. And that's what this is about, right? Like, it's just talking about the ambition and I think the fact that they choose to have it as a woman as well, and especially in 1948, like, that says a lot, because you could argue even today, but certainly back then, a woman wasn't really looked at as shouldn't have too much ambition outside of the home anyways. So I think that that's what the movie is about. And then the ballet just comes secondary. But again, I'm always hesitant to dismiss when people who are in that field or in that industry go, get up in arms about it. But at the same time, like, when you look at, say, this is very different, but it's like a TV show like ER or a show like Suits. I mean, those are very obviously not realistic depictions of either the medical world or the legal world. And yet they can be very entertaining, and nobody really gets too offended by that. But it is, I think, I don't know why with ballet it's such a specific thing, because it does seem to me that, I like Black Swan kind of had something similar-ish. Not as I from what it sounds like, this was a very they were very loudly critical of it. But I remember in Black Swan, like, there was a lot of talk about the actual technique of the dancers, and but it was also a little bit of saying that Natalie Portman wasn't giving enough credit for her dance. What do they call it? Like a stunt dancer, dance double.
Oh, yeah.
Which is different, but. Like, I am hesitant to just, like, kind of dismiss their concerns, because obviously there is a passion to it that they love. And I suppose that you could even put it the other way around and be like, if they had made, actually it has been made, like, movies about filmmaking is such a thing, but they can do it properly because that's their medium, versus a ballet person. But then, like you said, that's not the point of the movie. Yeah. And to get bogged down in that, and I think what you said at the very beginning of saying, like, to dismiss an entire film because of that, when it truly is a secondary thing, it does seem a bit short-sighted.
Yeah. I don't know how it has aged. The fact that, like, this movie is routinely considered one of the best, and someone like Gene Kelly, who I was reading was so inspired by and watched several times in theaters, and then decided to make An American in Paris, screened it something like 15 times for his cast and crew throughout the run of making An American in Paris, to be like, this is the movie that I am inspired by and that I want to make. And have you ever seen An American in Paris?
I haven't, no.
It's amazing. I love it. Great film. And, like, as soon as I was watching The Red Shoes, I was like, oh man, this feels like the American in Paris. And then I read that, I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense. Gene Kelly was someone who obviously was, one of the greatest dancers ever, but also someone who knew how to tell a cinematic story and knew how to use dance to tell a story. was able to look at this film and be like, I see exactly what they're doing, what they're taking from dance, and what they're bringing to the cinematic language and how they're combining them and making an interesting and a unique story. And that's what I want to take as well. Because if you look at someone, I've always preferred Gene Kelly movies over Fred Astaire movies, because Fred Astaire movies was always just like, oh, I'm a fancy gentleman. Now watch me tap dance for 5 minutes, and now I'm going to be a fancy gentleman again. Whereas Gene Kelly's movies always felt much more organic with incorporating dance into the story. And so I always really appreciated that about it. It's the same way with like musicals. I really hate it when it's like it's singing just for the sake of singing, but if it's more organically, intrinsically linked with the way you're telling the story, I appreciated it more.
Is Gene Kelly, though, I mean, obviously I know his reputation and his talents are inarguable, but in kind of the dance world, is he considered to be one of the greatest dancers of all time? Or is it just simply he's just one of the most well-known because of his movie career? Like, I'm not trying to downplay anything of Gene Kelly, of course, but it's like, is the reason that he is so is because he had a foot in both camps. Like, he had a mind of being a movie star, essentially, whereas Fred Astaire was a dancer who happened to be in film, and Gene Kelly is a dancer who wanted to be in film.
I'm not totally sure about how their reputations are in the dance community. Obviously, you know, when you try to name famous dancers, it'll be like people like Baryshnikov, who's like an actual ballet dancer, or Karen Kane, or people like that, where, you know, dance was their life and it wasn't sullied by film or anything like that. So I don't know. I think it's like it's like the people who talk about like theater actors versus film actors, be like, oh, Laurence Olivier is the greatest actor ever. It's like, well, you know, outside of his film work, how many people actually saw Laurence Olivier act? Yes, he was popular in his time, but unfortunately we don't have the ability to truly, you know, compare him to other actors as influence, because you had to be there in person, and there's nothing wrong with that. It seems to be, well, we can put him on a pedestal because he did theater and not film. I know he did do film, but a lot less. The same way with, like, you know, Kenneth Branagh is considered the other best actor ever because of his stage work, or Christopher Plummer, people like that, where their stage work is more about who they are before they are a screen actor. Same with the Broadway performers and stuff like that. So I don't really know how dancers compare, you know, Gene Kelly or Fred Astaire versus, you know, non-cinematic dancers, but I know they're revered, and so that's all I can really say. And like, I think, you know, in 1948, this movie was, you know, criticized by the dance community. I'm sure by now it is 100% embraced by the dance community, being like, look at one of the most beautiful ways that you've been able to put ballet to screen and make it cinematic for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's just a testament, though, to show that people just like to complain about things. Like, I mean, we still have it today. Like, people they're looking for things to complain about, looking for things to be mad about. And in a way, it's kind of a comfort that, you know, even back then, that's just how it went, because
nothing's changed.
people just wanted to be mad. It's more fun to criticize something and to shit on something than it is to say, hey, that was actually really amazing. And maybe something that was even helpful to the dance community, of being like putting them on a even higher pedestal that is out. But then again, like, to kind of my earlier comment was, maybe at the time, especially, they didn't want that. They didn't want ballet to be truly accessible to everybody. They wanted to keep it within a certain class of people. But I mean, yeah, today I would assume that we have the retrospect is going to be very positive, because it does show up on tons of lists year after year. And even with, I mean, we would need to consult somebody within the dance community today about whether or not it's held up. But my assumption would be it would be. And I mean, we could take a lot of the films today that get shit on and criticized in 50 some odd, or even more than 50, we're talking like 70 some odd years. Those movies will be looked at very differently, because they're not going to be so hampered down by just immediate knee-jerk outrage, which is what we all seem to enjoy generation after generation.
So I'll say this, in terms to my own dance background. I remember when I was dancing, several dance movies had come out, and anytime one would come out, whether it was stuff like Center Stage or Billy Elliot or Save the Last Dance, every time our teachers made sure to tell us, hey guys, there's a new dance movie that's out. You should definitely go check it out, because it's really cool seeing dance on stage and watching other people, do dance. And I remember there'd be like movie posters that featured dance. Those ones specifically, like Center Stage and Billy Elliot, would be up in our dance studio and like their offices and stuff like that. So I don't know if it was just the studio that I went to where there was an appreciation of it, of being like, hey kids, here's a way to also see, cool grown-ups or cool kids doing it as well. And that way, you sort of feel like you're a part of a wider community. It's not just, in these four walls, it's outside in the real world as well. So
I think that's particularly good for young people, like young dancers. If you're trying to, how many of those dancers went on to continue dancing into their, like, as a proper profession. And that's not just about desire and want. Obviously, there's a lot of things at play there, but it's like to keep the interest of a kid in a hobby is very, very difficult, because, when you're young, you're probably bouncing between a lot of different. Because that's the whole point of being a kid, right? Like, it's like you try a lot of different activities, a lot of different things to see what you like and don't like. So you didn't like soccer, you didn't like running and exerting yourself too much, athletically speaking. Although dance is very athletic, so I don't know what you're saying. But it's like, some people, like you try different sports and you go, I don't really like that. You tried, different instruments to play, okay, I like that, I don't like that. And one great way to foster that, I think, for kids in particular, is movies, because you could be like, hey, look at Jessica Alba and dancing in Honey. There was a period of time too where it was like dance movies were
from like the late 90s to the early 2000s.
Such a thing. Yeah, it was such a thing. It was such a thing, dance movies. Now they're not. They should come back. Those were fun, I think. But I do think they inspired a lot of kids to be like, I kind of want to go ask their parents to be like, I want to go to ballet lessons or something like that. Like, and that's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So getting into the movie, I find it took a little bit to like fully ground myself and understand what was going on. Like, I not that I thought it was bad, but it was just like, okay, what is the plot of this movie? And because it's a whole bunch of scenes and you're just wondering how it all sort of connects. And it really does take about an hour for you to really understand where this movie is going to, which I found very fascinating. Did you find any sort of issue with that when you're watching the movie, being like, okay, where is this movie going? Because most movies, within the first scene, you're like, okay, I know what movie they're setting up. I don't know how it's going to end, but I know what type of a story they're setting up. But I found it was a little tricky to pinpoint exactly what kind of movie this was.
I completely agree. So after I watched this last night, I thought, I'm really looking forward to doing this podcast, because not that I need to be convinced, but I'm curious to see if what we talk about in this film will change my mind about the movie, because I don't think the movie is bad by any stretch of the imagination. But I don't think it's that good either. And maybe it's the hype train behind it, but actually I only really read about it after I watched the movie. But for me, it was like, it's a good movie. I see what they're trying to do. I understand the themes. I understand like what they're trying to explore and touch on and discuss. But for me, there was just never anything there that it really hit me, that I really connected with, I suppose is the best way to say it. So I was very much so looking forward, because I know that's why I texted you yesterday and I said, like, did you like the movie? Because if you did, then I'm very curious to hear why you liked it and what it is about this film that I suppose you connect with, so that maybe it deserves a second watch. Because for me, it was maybe the worst thing that you can have with a movie when you leave it is just like you're very indifferent towards it. And I was very, very indifferent towards this film. Like you mentioned the Technicolor, like aesthetically speaking, I enjoyed that. I thought there was something very comforting about the way that it looked. But as a film as a whole, I just kind of left it being like, oh, okay, now I've watched it. But it neither grabbed me, nor did I turn away from it being like, this is the shittiest thing I've ever seen. Because obviously it's not. Like, obviously it's not a shitty movie. But it was just one of those, like, I was like, okay, that's done.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I think the three lead performances is what really grabbed me, especially. I really liked Anton Walbrook as Boris Lermontov. I love how for especially the first half of the movie, every time you see him, he's just like lurking in the shadows. And the fact that it's shot in Technicolor means you can actually see what's going on in the shadows. There's so many movies. Like, I just watched The Killer for the first time and loved it, absolutely adored the movie. And, you know, the big fight scene that he has with the Brute, I was watching on my laptop. I literally had to crank my contrast all the way up to sort of see what was going on. And that's a damn shame. Whereas in this movie, even though Boris is lurking in the shadows and it's pitch black, you can still make out what his facial reactions and what he's doing. And I think that just has something to do with the way it's shot and the color processing just makes everything just so bold and vivid that even the darkness looks beautiful.
But isn't that such a criticism of film today, though, right?
It
Is the
really
night
is.
scenes, is that you can't see. I was just watching something very recently, and I can't remember what it was now, but it was so dark. And it was in a movie theater too. So I assume it was like, I'm watching it in like optimally, this is the best that I can possibly watch this film. And it was still really, really dark to me. I can't remember what it was now, but yeah, I feel like there's this, it's just a real criticism for film today as opposed to like praising it. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to take anything away from Red Shoes, but it's like, rather than looking at it as like praising that film for looking that way, it almost just seems like today it's just we're getting really used to not being able to see anything, especially when it's dark, and that's really annoying, and that's such a shame to go backwards. And I don't know if it's digital versus like the film that they're using or what it is, but it's very frustrating. And I do think this film was just, it's shot gorgeously. Like, there's the one thing that I came away from watching this was that it felt, even though it's from 1948, it felt very nostalgic to me. Like, it felt like a movie that I would have watched when I was young as a kid. And it's almost like a Disney movie. And I say that in a great way. Like, it just has a very warm look to it. Even in the scenes where it's not warm, even when it's like getting a bit horrendous, it's like there's something, just the general tone of the aesthetic is that it's a very warm film. And I felt very nostalgic for it, even though it's obviously from not my time.
It had a feeling of almost something like The Wizard of Oz, where like you could totally see this is a movie that comes on TV every year at a certain, you know, holiday or whatever. And you just grew up and it was just on in the TV in the background every year. Yeah,
it's very and maybe it just is a testament too to say, like, between 1948 and then, like, say the 90s, when we were growing up and watching stuff, like, the technology had improved. Obviously, it had definitely improved, but the jump that we've made from the 90s to today is like exponentially higher than what it was from 1948 to, say, 1998. And I think that to me is kind of an interesting point as well, but that's more about filmmaking things. But yeah, this movie, I was taken by, I like the performances too. I thought the performances were great. And so I can see why that's kind of the thing to pull you in. But yeah, I don't know. As a film, it just didn't really do it for me.
I liked that, you know, everyone was actually incredibly serious about their work. And it felt very professional. Obviously, you know, the last act, especially when things get very heightened, when things sort of come to a head of choosing between your love life and your work life and things like that, everyone starts acting a little irrational. But like and that's, you know, obviously a dramatic point that needed to be made. But up until that point, I thought everyone, you know, despite being very serious, I didn't feel like anyone was being abusive. I didn't like, everything was rooted in rationality. And that's something I've always really appreciated in film. And, you know, we talked about that with Kyle Edward Ball on our Canadian horror episode, where I loved where there was the rationality in the horror movies that he had picked. And it was something that I sort of appreciated in this movie as well, where like, Lermontov, you know, truly did want to put on the best show possible. And he was like very strict about everyone's schedules, but like, you know, was respectful of their talent as well. And Julian Craster, you know, was a perfectionist with it, trying to, you know, train the orchestra, but it made sense. There was a reason why he was doing what he was doing. And Victoria Page and the other dancers were very committed to their dance. And so I sort of appreciate the way that they actually framed all of that.
So it's like, it's realistic. It's like a lot more realistic than maybe, say, today it would be a bit more broad and a little bit more melodramatic, and even though there are some melodramatic moments in the movie, but like, I know what you mean. Like, especially up until that last bit, it is very much so rooted and very grounded in what you imagine, the behind the scenes to look like at things. And it's never, and maybe that kind of speaks to what you were saying at the beginning of saying like, it's a bit of a slow burn at the beginning coming into it. And maybe it's because like, it's so realistic to life, because life is generally just a slow burn. It's very rarely the highs and lows that we like, the extreme highs and lows that we see in film. And maybe that's why it's just kind of, it's very middle ground, but it's also very real, because that's typically how it goes. And until I don't want to say it jumps a shark. I think that makes it sound like very flippant, but like until they really go into the fairy tale aspect of it.
Yeah.
That's when it flips into a different type of movie almost. But up until then, it is very real, and it's very middle, like it's very middle waving. It doesn't kind of vacillate too much.
Like they're serious, and they could be cold and a little bit mean, but no one ever, I feel like no one crosses a line into, Boris is abusing his dancers or his musicians, or is, being unreasonable or cruel or things like that, where it just felt realistic in the sense of like, we've all been in high pressure work environments, sometimes things can get a little testy and uncomfortable, but like, hopefully, I don't want to speak for you. Hopefully, we've never been in a situation where it's like, okay, you have obviously crossed the line of what is professional and what is unprofessional, and you have now gone to the point of no return where you cannot take back what you have said or done.
Yeah, no comment. It's
Fair enough.
No comment. I'd say, yeah. I mean, I think that's 99%, I would say, of working experiences is like that, right? Like it is people being respectful to one another. And that's kind of a nice thing too, is that generally speaking, I think humans don't want to be cruel to each other. And if they are cruel, it's kind of a clueless cruelty in many ways. But yeah, I think that it would have been very, very easy to make the Boris character this almost tyrannical person, like this kind of man on a mission, doesn't care what he does or who he hurts to achieve that goal that he wants to achieve. And then at the end, like, I mean, if it was made today, people would be like, but then he's like an artistic genius. That's the whole point.
He would be Lydia Tarr.
Exactly. Yeah. I didn't like that movie. But it's exactly. But it is, I do wonder, it's kind of interesting that they haven't redone this movie to today, because it would be an interesting one to see through a more modern day lens of how different, not necessarily how different the reality is, because I would argue that the reality is probably very similar to what it was back then, but I think the way that we want to see those types of characters portrayed is very, very different now.
Yeah, that's fair. It's funny. I tried to go into this movie as blind as possible as well, and so I'm watching it, and as I said, the introduction, we're setting up all these different characters and don't really know how it's connected. And then finally we see Victoria Page dancing in, I don't want to call it a community theater group, but it was like a smaller ballet group in London. And we watch her dance, and it's a pretty uninterrupted, dance sequence where we see her do, bits of several numbers, but it's actually seeing her dance. I'm like, okay, this woman clearly has some sort of dance training. I didn't know who she was or what her background was. And when the movie was over, I looked up. I was like, oh, this was her first acting role. And she turned it down for like 2 years straight before she finally agreed to be in it. She was a dancer, and that was what her career was dance. She only did a handful of movies throughout her career. And I think that really shone through. Her acting, I thought, was quite good, and I was very impressed with her acting, but it was her dance that everything about it was absolutely believable. There was a moment in it where I saw her walking away, and I was like, she walks like a dancer, and that's something that like you can't fake. I grew up around dancers, and then I went to an arts high school where there was a dance program as well, and so all growing up, I was surrounded by dancers, and I know what a dancer's walk looks like. They have this very, back perfectly straight, their feet sort of pointed outwards, not inwards or straight as well, and they have a bit of a waddle when they walk. And she did that, and I was like, oh, this woman was a trained dancer. And looking it up afterwards and learning all that about her, I was like, oh, this makes perfect sense. And I thought I love the fact that they decided to go a dancer who could be trained to act or act, not an actor who can dance.
I find it really, so like I'm not a dancer at all, but it's like it is interesting that you can, I think most people can see a dancer, and there's something about it, it's very inexplicable too. Like I remember when I watched Rice Boy Sleeps and I was looking at Choi Sung-yoon, who plays the mom. I just remember thinking she's so graceful on the screen. The way she moves across the screen is in a way that it just felt really different to how I see normal people just moving across, like just walking, for example, like you said, like just walking. And then when I talked to Anthony Shim and he was like, oh no, she's like a dancer. She's a ballet dancer. I'm like, oh, it makes sense. And it's so funny to me that like those little things, it's not necessarily watching them dance even, because you're right, like Moira Shearer, when she's moving on the screen, there is a grace to her, but I kind of bought into it because it's like she's a ballet dancer in the movie. But I do love that. I do love the idea of finding a ballet dancer versus trying to train up an actor. I mean, does that mean then that it's easier to be an actor than it is to be a ballet dancer? Probably, actually. I'm going to assume it is much easier to be an actor than a ballet dancer. But yeah, I think she had this, I didn't even think to look that up. There was just something about her that it was very, very natural. And I kind of, maybe part of my brain just assumed that they would have gotten an actual dancer, because the way that they did the cuts, like I brought up Black Swan before. It's like Black Swan, you can clearly tell when they shoot away from Natalie Portman and Mila Kunis. Like you can tell when it's not them because they're not showing their full body. Like you can see that all the time in any dance movie or even fighting films, right? Like that's fighting choreography like that. Whereas in this one, yes, there are times that they will focus just on the feet, but like there are more than enough shots of seeing her whole body, and like you see the full shot of her dancing, and you can tell like it's absolutely her. It's not like they sub somebody else in to do the dancing for her, which is it shouldn't be a treat, but it really is a treat to see that in film, especially
since she does point, which is an even more intense and harder version of ballet. Obviously, that's also what Black Swan is. And Natalie Portman did grow up dancing as a child. She took dance lessons, but didn't continue it
not
in
to
a way
that.
of, yeah. So I think she was able to get away with it more than Mila Kunis was able to. But still, I know they did require a body double for some sequences as well too. But for this, it was great that we knew every single shot, whether it was showing her feet, her legs, her arms, or her face, it was Moira Shearer doing all of it.
It's interesting. I feel like, is that something kind of subconscious almost that we clock? Like, I don't know if there was a point that I looked and I went, oh, like we're seeing her whole body. And so it's like, it's definitely her. Whereas you just it just feels very organic. And I want, like, maybe that's why it works so well in this movie. But then again, although the criticism for the dance was never about her performance, though.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah,
it was about the stage.
Never about her performance. Yeah. Fair.
And then I'd say someone like Marius Goring, who played Julian Craster. They don't show him playing piano all the time, but they do show him playing piano enough that I don't know if he was also he was an actor. He was not a musician. He was an actor. Make no mistake about that. So much so that he was actually the founder of the UK Actors Union, which is very interesting. I learned about him afterwards. He was one of the founding members.
Very topical. Very topical
yes,
at the moment.
Good on Marius Goring there for that. But there was enough shots of him actually playing the piano and actually conducting that, like, you could tell that this was a man that had some sort of a training. There's a story that I just read that came out in terms of Maestro, of Bradley Cooper spent 6 years or something like that, 4 years learning how to conduct 6 minutes worth of music for the film. And it's like, yeah, that's insane, but like that's how long it takes to look proficient at a world-class level to do something as small as that. And I was really impressed that Powell and Pressburger were like, no, you're playing a musician, so we're going to make you play the music, the instrument, and we're going to show it.
Yeah. My favorite thing I learned when I did my little adult ballet classes was they had like a piano player in the room, and I just didn't think, because I'm like, we're just a bunch of, majority of people were probably like 20s and 30-year-olds who clearly are never going to be ballet dancers ever in our lifetime. But it's like, even for us, and I asked the teacher about it. I was just like, how come, it'd be very easy to just play a track or something. That's what I was thinking. And he goes, no. It's like, this is very important in ballet, is like that you have a proper piano player there, and like you have live music to listen to go through. And then, so when I saw it, anytime I see that now in like Seven Veils, for example, like that's opera, but like they actually have like people there playing and like live instruments playing. And I don't know. I find it very touching and very nice, because I didn't realize that was such a thing. Like that was such an important aspect of it. So you're right. Like, good on them for saying like this. They knew it was important, and they're gonna do it. Like, if you're gonna do it, you're gonna do it right.
Yeah, and I think it sort of connects. There's a great scene in the film where Victoria and Julian have been arguing about the tempo of one of the songs, where, you know, Julian, who's this musical mastermind, has come up with this incredible score for this ballet, and Victoria is this incredible dancer, and she's saying at one point that the music is too fast for her to properly do the move that has been choreographed for her to do. And Julian's going, no, this is how the music needs to go in order for the whole piece to make sense. I need to play it at this pace. And she's going, I can't dance at that pace. I'm a world-class dancer and I can't do this. And they're arguing back and forth, and it's like we have quite a few scenes where they're sort of sniping at each other back and forth. And then there's this scene where on the opening night where she's getting ready and they continue the argument, and then he just goes, you know what? Dance how you want to dance. I will play to you. And I think that sort of speaks to, you know, you talking about having a live instrumentalist accompany you dance. And one, it's so that way, you know, you and the rest of the dancers can feel the music quite literally. But two, if the accompanist realizes that you're either the group is going too fast or too slow, they can adjust their playing very subtly to match your tempo, and everything will work out flawlessly and no one will be able to tell the difference. And I thought that was a great moment between the two of them. And it really sparked something where I didn't expect Julian and Victoria to fall in love. And as soon as that happened, I was like, oh, something is going on here.
Maybe I don't know why I knew. I was like, oh yeah, they're gonna fall in love. I don't know why I thought that though. There wasn't anything. It was
probably obvious because they were setting them up that way. But like it was that moment where I was just like, here it is. Like there's so many times we watch in movies where we're told characters have fallen in love. You're like, okay, but like I don't really believe it. You say you're in love, but you haven't shown me anything. Or is this? It was that moment where, you know, he smirks, gives a little laugh, and it was just like, you know what? You do what you want to do, and I'm going to follow you. And it was that moment where we're just like, oh, that's really sweet, actually.
You're right. Like they build up to their relationship really nicely. Like all the arguing, all the sniping, it just leads up, and without being cheesy too. Like they don't do it in a very obvious way. It's just like two people who are very passionate about what they do, but it's through that passion that they're arguing with one another that you can see that even though they're disagreeing with one another, it's like they recognize the similarity in each other, and then that's kind of what brings them together. So I do like how the love story pans out in this. I think that it's nice how like they very naturally come to that conclusion versus like, of course they're going to get together. What are we talking about? Of course they hook up at some point.
It's a 1948 Hollywood movie, of course.
It's like, come on. So yeah, it's interesting though. That part of the movie I did very, very much so enjoy.
And then because we don't even see them, you know, hooking up or secretly rendezvousing or all this sort of stuff. There's a couple little moments where they leave a few breadcrumbs and things like that, where like where Victoria first gets offered the lead role and she's told to go back to her hotel and go to sleep because she's got a busy day the next day. And her and Julian meet on the balcony at the hotel or whatever. And they're like, aren't you supposed to be asleep? Aren't you supposed to be asleep? Yeah. And so it's like little breadcrumbs like that. But then we don't actually see them get together. And it's not until, you know, much later in the film when it's Boris's birthday or something like that. And he sits down and he goes, everyone in the company is here. And he's looking around and he doesn't see Victoria and he doesn't see Julian. And that's when they overtly say that they are together for the first time. But it was one of those things where just like, I sort of appreciate it that they allowed this romance where they left us breadcrumbs to connect the dots and understand why they might fall in love, but they don't need to actually show us going on dates, and they don't need to show us kissing or in bed together or all those things like that. We just understand implicitly what they had set up had made sense up until that point. Whereas any other movie, they'd be forcing it of like, see, these guys are in love. They're in love. They're sneaking behind Boris's back. Don't you get it? So I appreciate that we didn't need to see it to understand it.
Do you think that one of the reasons that we love or like we hold these movies up so highly, and not just us as in you and I, but like the movie community in general, the reason that these films like these are held in such high esteem is because, in contrast to what we have today, it's better, you know, like in terms like what you just said, like they're showing a lot more than they're just exposition dumping onto us, which is a much more common thing to do now. But that should be the standard. Like that should be what all movies should be like that. You know what I mean? Like that should be our base level. And it shouldn't be something that we even point out to say, oh, that's amazing. Cause it should just be a given that that's how it goes. And I always think about that. Like when we watch old movies like that, of like how much of this should we just be saying like that's just like that should be the standard. But because obviously we watch a lot of modern day films, and the new releases that come out, that you're just like, oh, movies aren't made like that anymore. Kind of sucks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like as much as I, hate the Hollywood code because of what the politics of it implied, so many great movies came out of directors being like, well, if I can't show this, how can I tell the audience what I really mean?
Yeah.
And I don't think this is a movie that's impacted by the code in any sort of way. It's before that era, really. But still, it's a lot of, we're going to imply things, we're going to leave you a trail, and we're going to write it so that way when we do have to tell you something, you understand it and you believe it.
That's a good point. It's like very artistic workarounds.
Yes, yeah. Which, result in some of the greatest films of all time. I love that era, and so it's no difference there. I'd love to talk specifically a bit more about the dance sequence. I know you said you haven't seen American in Paris, but this movie came out 4 years before then and 3 years before Singing in the Rain, and both of which feature, an extended, ballet/modern dance sequence that is sort of the centerpiece of the film, where you're talking about a 15-20 minute chunk of the movie where it's not about moving the movie forward. It's about, let us just showcase the dancing ability of everyone involved. And The Red Shoes is clearly the pioneer in that aspect of, because I said it came out 3 and 4 years before those other two very, very notable films. And I have to imagine that it was also influential to Singing in the Rain as well. I absolutely love that sequence. What about you?
I think it's gorgeous. I think I love dance sequences like that, or like just moments. La La Land's a good example of a movie that like I didn't really like the movie as a whole, but that last sequence that they have, is it the last thing that they do? It's not the last thing that they do, but it's like one of the kind of the big showpiece towards the end. Mm-hmm. I love those kinds of things because I feel like one of the greatest things about watching a movie is getting lost inside the world of that movie. And those types of sequences to me, for me rather, they achieve it like every single time. Every time I watch those, it's like I just completely get lost in what is going on in those performances, because one, it's uncut. Like, I don't know if they did cut, but like it just seems like just this very beautiful continuous move that they do, and so you never break from it. You're just kind of with it the whole time, and then obviously it's executed beautifully and perfectly. And so I always love those. Are like, I'm a real sucker for scenes like that.
Yeah, me too. I've really come to appreciate it. It was funny, the first time I watched Singing in the Rain, I didn't care for it, and then I rewatched it a couple years ago, and I was like, no, I was completely wrong. This is a masterpiece. And it was mostly because I thought that the end sequence in that movie didn't work for me. And I think it's one of the very few times, most of the times I rewatch a film, even if it's been a long time, where I'm like, oh yeah, I remember not liking it very much, or I remember liking it. Usually my opinion sort of stays the same, more or less. Very rarely have I had a oh, I might like something more or like it less, but I won't switch from one side to the other. And Singing in the Rain was the one time where I was like, no, I was 100% wrong. I don't know why I didn't like it the first time I watched it. I don't know if I wasn't in the right mood or the headspace or I wasn't appreciating it, but I was wrong. And it was because of that dance sequence that really changed my mind specifically. And seeing another, a 17-minute take here where the movie just stops. Let's just stop, take a moment, and enjoy the ballet. And I love that.
I do too. It's like it takes a nice breath and kind of gets you ready for a bunch. It's a good point in the film where it's like there is a shift about to happen, because then a little bit while after that, then that's when the fairy tale stuff kind of comes into the movie. So it almost serves as a bit of a break, like a bit of an intermission almost from the film. A little bit,
yeah.
Yeah, and in a great way. Like, I think it works in a great way. But on that note of watching films the first time and not liking them, I'm always really fascinated when I hear people have such a shift in opinion, because I know it's happened to me too, where it's like, for some reason, not that you hated a movie, but it just really didn't work for you. And then years later, you decide to revisit it. But the big question is why did you revisit it? Because if you really didn't like it the first time, then why would you ever watch it again? But then when you do, and then your opinion is completely changed of it, I think that that's one of the most fascinating things when it comes to film watching and film appreciating. I always enjoy it. So it's funny that Singing in the Rain is that for you. Yeah,
it's very funny. But I think that sequence in particular is helped the most by the Technicolor aspect. Her shoes are stunning to look at. They're so iconic looking, right up there with like Judy Garland's ruby red slippers in The Wizard of Oz, or things like that, where it's just an accessory that is so bold and so essential to the story and making it memorable that it works. And then I think Moira Shearer is stunning to look at herself. And I almost wonder if she was cast because of her flaming red hair. She looks so good on the Technicolor because she's as vivid as her shoes are.
And I want to say the makeup as well. They do an incredible job with the makeup and like really taking advantage of the Technicolor, but also like stage makeup is wild. Like stage makeup never looks great when you see somebody, a few inches from your face or whatever. It doesn't ever look good. And
they do extreme close-ups of her face.
Yeah, and it looks crazy, but it's also like artistic.
It's part of the story.
Yeah, it really serves the narrative. And I think that that's something in the film that I can appreciate, is that everything that they put in, from the costuming to the makeup to, everything about like those little kind of technical details that don't necessarily always serve the plot. Like in this movie, there's a narrative purpose to almost everything that they do, like including that dance sequence. It isn't just throwing in a dance sequence for the sake of throwing in a dance sequence. Like it does serve a purpose to the overall experience of watching the movie.
Yeah. And I loved all the costumes in that sequence as well. Like there's
they're really
a scene
great.
of like where they have like light gels over them, where it's like colored cellophane, and they look like sheet music and all that sort of stuff in newspaper, and all of them just look so stunning, and it's just gorgeous to look at. It's just one of those things where you can kind of like just sit back and pause any moment and be like, you know what? I really like film because of this.
That's such a great, it's not a film bro comment, it's a very great cinephile comment. Being like, it's like I imagine Martin Scorsese in his screening room pausing this and being like, this is cinema. This is it. Cinema. This is it right here. Yeah. This is cinema. Capital C cinema.
He's doing the Bong Joon-ho meme of this is cinema.
Yeah.
But yeah, everything looks great in it. And like I've seen, like if you go to IMDb and you look at the stills, they clearly are from before the restoration. And like it looks ugly. It's way too bluish. It's not color corrected. The red shoes are, kind of dull. She blends into everything. But then you see this restored version that they have now, and it's just it's one of those things where I messaged you afterwards, where I was just like talking about Martin Scorsese, because he apparently owns the actual red shoes that they used in the film. And I'm like, oh, I'm not surprised. Thelma Schoonmaker, who's his editor, is the widow of Michael Powell, one of the writers and directors of the film. So it sort of makes sense. And they were instrumental in the restoration. And Martin Scorsese, even if he wasn't a director, has done more for cinema than just about any other person alive with his act of preservation.
Yeah. Act of preservation, and then not just of American films too. I think that's what impresses me the most about him being an American director. And no offense to the Americans, but it's like typically there is a very a focus on Hollywood and American film. And so I really respect that Martin Scorsese is looking at, when he considers film, he's considering international. Like it's the world, it's a medium for the world.
Specifically African cinema too.
He's done a really, like, that's why it it bothers me when I know it's just the internet and he doesn't care. He's Martin Scorsese. What does he care about? A bunch of like teenage fanboys, what they have to say about him. But it does annoy me when all that stuff with the Marvel came out and like people were just shitting on him, being like, oh, like he's just this old man. He's like boomer, blah. And I'm like, no, because Martin Scorsese has done so much for this art form that, to the point that I feel like we don't even really appreciate fully to the extent what he has done for people who enjoy film and who enjoy like collecting, physical media with the restorations and things like that. Like those people who really appreciate that. He is without a doubt one of the biggest drivers of that certainly in the modern era. And I just appreciate the scope that he has for it, because I think we would have lost probably a lot of stuff if it wasn't for him.
Yeah, like just think about this movie in particular. This was nominated for 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. It won 2 of them. It's one of the highest grossing UK movies of all time. And if, 20 years ago, Martin Scorsese wasn't like, oh, damn, this movie is in complete disarray, maybe we should do something about it, it just would be lost to the sands of time.
Yeah, it would be. It would be, and or it would be lost to just a very specific group of people. Like it would have been one of those movies that only like you had to have done film studies in school or something like that.
But you still wouldn't have seen a good version of it.
It's true, yeah. But even then, I mean, like you're losing the technical aspect of it. But a good story should just be a good story, regardless.
Yes.
But we're lucky to have somebody who's like not just has the desire to do it, but also has the resources to do it. Because like, let's face it, one of the reasons he's able to do what he does is because he's Martin Scorsese.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
So, and like I say the same thing, like Chris Nolan is like that too. Like the reason that he is able to do 70 millimeter IMAX is because he's Chris Nolan. Not everybody can just do that.
Or make practical effects instead of CGI because it's him. Yeah.
I mean, he's like, this is very off track, but like right now he's talking about how he's focusing on getting the Blu-ray together. And I think a lot of people at first were like, what do you mean? Like just put on Blu-ray? Like what are we talking about? But he's spent so much effort on making sure that the home video that we're going to have to like forever and ever on your shelf is going to be the best version that it possibly can be. Most directors, I'd say most filmmakers probably don't have the luxury of telling Universal Pictures, actually hold up, I'm going to spend months on this before you're allowed to put it out there and make money off of it. So it's people like filmmakers like that. Like I appreciate that. Yes, they have the resources and they are at the top of the food chain, but they are using their power for good. Yeah. And I appreciate
and that's a big thing that like we always, this is completely sidetracked now. We're always asking of people in positions of power is to use your platform for the greater good as well. And like, Martin Scorsese and Christopher Nolan is not solving the Middle East crisis, and they're not ending world hunger, and they're not curing cancer, which, maybe we should be devoting more resources to stuff like that. But also, they know what their lane is, and they know what they need to do to preserve not just themselves, but everyone else in their
They know
industry.
what they can contribute to society, and what they contribute is valuable, and maybe not as valuable as curing cancer, but it's still valuable and it's needed. So I have a lot of respect for Scorsese taking the time out, especially, I mean, I hate to say like in his old age, but he could retire, and nobody in any other profession, he would be retired right now and just living off of his, not RSP, would be what, 401k in the States? Like he'd just be chilling, but he's not. He's continuing to do these things. And so it annoys me when I see the Marvel people feel the need to like bring him down a notch. I'm like, nah, he deserves it. He deserves the pedestal.
Right. I'll say this also. I really miss hand painted opening credits.
Yes.
Like, they're so much better. I love watching older movies. I think anyone that listens to the podcast knows that I'm a huge older movie fan, but there's just something about watching older movies with the credits and just being like, I miss these.
Yeah. I'm like,
or
just
like title cards.
It speaks to something though. It's just the effort that used to be made in making a film. And I know that the reason that effort was there was because they had no other choice, right? Like if they could type it up on a computer, they would have, right? Like they absolutely would have done it. But the fact that that's just what the circumstances were. And so it necessitated this really beautiful art form. Like, and now that we're missing it, and it's like, I'm not saying that we should necessarily go back to like hand-drawn animation all the time or things like that, but it is a lost, I mean, literally a lost art. It is literally a lost art that we don't have that, but I mean, I get why we don't, but I completely agree with you. Anytime that you see those things, also putting the credits at the beginning is still such a thing. Like, I don't know why I guess they changed it for whatever, but
Star Wars, blame Star Wars.
Yeah,
quite literally.
Good point. But it's this idea of like you sit there and you actually look at it forces you to look at the names of the people who made this movie, and you might not really be clocking it, but it's there. And versus at the end of the movie when it's done, everybody's getting up to go as the credits are rolling. So that's a nice thing. Old films are, I mean, there's good things that we've moved on from in filmmaking, and I suppose the film industry as a whole, but there are a lot that we are missing, I think, and it's too bad that we're missing. Yeah.
It always baffles me when people aren't a fan of older films. One of my brothers in particular, thinks that anything older than like 1995 is an old movie and he cannot watch it. And I'm just like,
why is it? Is it the
relate?
Tone like he doesn't get, or is it the sorry, I don't want to say he doesn't get, but is it like the tone, or is it the way that it looks?
Yeah, I think it's the tone, the way people talk, the way things are structured, the lack of CGI. Like, he's 31, so it's not like he's like, oh, these damn TikTok kids or whatever have no patience. I've
heard this. It's not just like, I've heard a lot of people say this, that they don't like watching older films. Like I heard somebody say they didn't want to watch Indiana Jones because like the effects aren't great, and I'm like, I mean, that's silly, because Indy is one of like in terms of adventure-based films, Indy is one of the best that's ever been made. And so you're just like, it's, yes, the melting of the face. If I saw that in a movie today, I'd be like, what the hell? But we see a ton of CGI in movies today that do not look good. So I don't really, whenever I hear people say that, and they're like, the funnier comment to me is when people say they don't like watching black and white films. I was like, why? What's wrong with black and white films? I go, because it's not in color. I go, well, yes, that's correct. It's not in color, but I just don't see I suppose it's, but even when I was a kid, like when you're scrolling on TV and like Three Stooges or I Love Lucy comes on, like my thought was never, oh, it's black and white, I can't watch it. I just remember thinking that's old, but I'll watch it anyways. But yeah, I don't know. People have a bit of a mental block when it comes to that kind of stuff for whatever reason. I don't know.
It does, yeah. All right. Do you have any last things you want to discuss?
No, I will say I don't know if my opinion has changed on the film, or if I have enough interest to watch it again. But I am glad I watched it, because it is one of those, it's on the list of best ofs all the time, especially in British cinema. This is really, really held up quite high. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad I watched it. And my favorite thing about it would be the makeup, because I think the makeup is pretty crazy and fun, and I really enjoy it. So that's my takeaway from the Red Shoe. Was it what you had hoped it would be? Like, was it kind of knowing that this was a missing bit on your list? Did it hold up to expectation, whatever expectation you had for it?
Yeah, I think so. I had very, very high expectations. And like I said, at the beginning, I wasn't confused by it, but I just wasn't sure where the movie was going or what type of movie it was setting up. And I was definitely a little surprised that the extended dance sequence, which I knew about, happened basically in the middle of the film. I thought it was going to be like an end of the film sort of thing, and it wasn't.
Kind of like La La Land, like what we think of with La La Land, yeah.
But even like in American in Paris or Singing in the Rain, both of them have their extended dance sequences at the very end of the film. It's sort of capping everything together of like, you've watched the whole movie come together and now watch the beautiful dance sequence. And that's what I thought was going to happen. So it was very surprising when I'm watching this movie where it's like building up. Here's the dance sequence. Okay. And now everything else. So it was a very interesting structured film for me. but I want to still really appreciate it.
Maybe that's what the movies today should do. Like the 3.5 hour, 3 hour long movies. They should put a dance break. Like imagine Oppenheimer with a great dance break in the middle. You're just like, excellent. Let's move on now to the legal proceedings of the Senate hearings. This is excellent.
This is cinema.
Chris Nolan's in his screening room like, this is great. I've really done something here.
All right. Yeah. Chris Nolan ballet movie when?
I'd love to see a Chris Nolan ballet movie. How dope would that be? That'd be amazing. And it would have like some weird time thing happening.
Oh, of course it would.
I'd enjoy the crap out of that.
The dancer is simultaneously on their deathbed and a newborn baby at the same time that they're in the prime of their career.
They're turning counterclockwise and anti-clockwise at the same time. It's just wild. It's just wild. Man, if we could get into Chris Nolan's ear, this could be something. It's going to be a great follow-up to Oppenheimer. It's going to be amazing.
Nolan, I know you're listening to this.
Yeah.
You got to do this next.
Chris, come on, man. Come on.
All right. Excellent. Hey, listeners. Contrazoompod is recorded using a program called Zencastr. I use Zencastr because it's super easy, and when I started podcasting, it was really tricky trying to find ways to record the show with people who are not in the same room as me. If you're all in the same room, it's super easy. You just, plug and go. You can do it however you want. But when you're especially online and you want to record with people, whether they're in a different city or a different country, wherever they might be, it can be tricky. Zencastr is great because I can have people record their audio and it's localized. So that means the audio always sounds terrific, because in the past it would be whatever's the host computer, the host being me. And so if there's any delays, lag, audio issues, things like that, it would end up being on my end. So it would sound like someone was talking through a tin can with a wire through it connected to my computer. As opposed to using Zencastr, it's recorded locally, so the audio is always crisp and clear, which is why the show, in my opinion, has fantastic audio. Now, Zencastr is an all-in-one tool, and if you have thought about podcasting before and realized that you need a lot of different tools and services, those days are over. With Zencastr's all-in-one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast all in one place and distribute to Spotify, Apple, and other major destinations, just like this show. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my code ContraZoom, and you'll get 30% off your first month of Zencastr paid plan. I want you to all have the same easy experiences I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story. All right, Rachel, I thought it was great talking about the Red Shoes at 75 years. I really love doing these anniversary specials. It's really fun giving an excuse to sort of watch a classic movie, whether it's the first time or favorite rewatch, things like Casablanca and stuff like that. So I'm glad we're doing this, and I know we do a couple a year, so I'm excited to see which ones we can possibly do next year. But all that said, what have you been working on recently? Anything you want to promote or share, and where can people find you?
Go to rachelho.com and on Instagram and Twitter at _RachelKH. What am I working on? I'm trying to think what's going to be out by the time. Probably nothing by the time this goes live. But yeah, there's like some cool features coming out soon, and all that's going to be on Exclaim.
Nice. Well, that's good to hear. I know you also recently covered the Real Asian Film Festival for the Asian Cut as well.
Yes, and there will be more on POV Magazine and on Exclaim for that. I just haven't done it yet, but it will get done, even though the festival's ending this weekend. But shout out to the Real Asian Festival. It seemed a bit dodgy at one point that they weren't going to be able to go ahead this year, just for funding reasons. But I think the film community / the Asian community really pulled out for them, which is great.
Nice. That is excellent to hear. On sort of a similar-ish note, we just covered the Imaginative Film Festival. Obviously, last week's episode was recapping the festival, and Jeff Bulmer was on, but Jeff wrote a couple reviews as well for the festival. He did Hey Victor and Fancy Dance, 2 films that were playing. If you're not, bookmarking contrazoompod.com, definitely do it. We're increasing our movie reviews. We've got more people writing and contributing to the website. Lots of great stuff going on, and very excited to keep moving forward. We're going to have hopefully some even more high profile stuff coming out soon as well. But this has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at contrazoompod. What movie anniversary milestone should we celebrate next? Send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.